Comments will be provided by Ohad Nachtomy, Bar Ilan University.
Thank you. Since I find Maria Rosa's paper clear, subtle, and convincing, I will not seek to criticize it in my brief comment. What I'd like to do instead is to amend its approach by addressing an issue that runs through her paper from somewhat different angle. In particular, the point I wish to address is very clearly articulated in the final paragraph of her paper as follows. So the necessary limitation of creatures, qua creatures, makes it possible, although not necessary, that rational and free creatures will choose moral evil and thereby give origin to physical evil. In other words, the necessary limitations of creatures has as a consequence the possibility of moral and physical evil, but not its necessity, end quote. I think that this is a very precise statement of what Leibniz seeks to achieve. Whether he achieves it or not is, of course, an open question. And in what follows, I'll be seeking to approach the question of how the imperfections and limitations of creatures could or could not be the source of their ability or liability to perform virtuous and non-virtuous deeds. In other words, the question might be formulated in terms of how metaphysical imperfections of creatures, imperfections related to their very essence and expressed in their complete concepts, may be seen as the source of their moral imperfection. How, in particular, the metaphysical imperfections of intelligent creatures may bear on the moral aspects of their actions and passions so that they can be held responsible for them. If this can be shown, the sinister shadow of Leibniz's notion of metaphysical evil can be at least somewhat relieved. I would like to begin, however, by asking a rather general question, which has an interest of its own, it seems to me. That is, what is the relation between perfection and infinity in Leibniz? So I'll begin with this question, and it will lead to where I want to go. So first, let me note that there is an obvious distinction to draw between the notion of perfection and that of perfections, which Leibniz often uses to describe the positive attributes of God and of creatures. Second, let us observe that, as Leibniz says in the first paragraph to the Discourse on Metaphysics, there are various completely different ways of being perfect, and that God has them all, each in the highest degree. So clearly there are degrees of perfections according to Leibniz. Furthermore, in this paragraph, Leibniz also tells us that the mark of perfection is that it cannot have a greatest, so that the greatest number and the greatest shape are not perfections. This suggests that at least one sense of perfection is not quantifiable. And indeed, this is a case of God's perfection. God, the most perfect being, cannot be perfect in a quantitative sense, for otherwise it would be as contradictory as the notion, I should say its notion would be as contradictory as that of the greatest number or the greatest shape. Interestingly also, Leibniz says that perfection is a degree of essence, which is the very principle of existence, as we know, so that God realizes the highest perfection possible. So perfection seems to be also the filter according to which God chooses which set of compossible individuals to realize. Unlike the way Descartes employs the analogy between infinity and perfection in his Meditations, Leibniz's analogy between perfection and infinity, perfection and finitude or limitation, is restricted to one sense of infinity. Unlike Descartes, Leibniz draws a distinction between different senses and different degrees of infinity. Whereas the infinity of God is absolute and includes all perfections, creatures are infinite but in a partial and limited sense. If the analogy between perfection and infinity may be developed along this line, then creatures are also partly perfect. That is, perfect in a particular sense, the sense that defines their unique essence or nature. But unlike God, creatures have some perfections, but also many imperfections and limitations. This complex and interesting status of creatures requires much clarification, of course, which I cannot even begin here. My motivation here is merely to draw attention to this complex and interesting status, which I think may also constitute the source of creatural capacity for morality and immorality. And it seems to me that we can gain some insight into this status by drawing the analogy between perfection and in infinity. It is interesting to note in this connection that Leibniz distinguished between at least 3 degrees of infinity. And these corresponds to 3 degrees of perfection and imperfection, and which also correspond to degrees of being and probably to degrees of activity versus passivity, although I won't go into that. An early formulation of this distinction, that is between degrees of infinity, appears in Leibniz's response to Spinoza's letter on the infinite, which he reads in 1676. According to Spinoza, absolute infinity is distinct from the infinite in kind. Absolute infinity qualifies God, and the infinite in its kind qualify God's attributes. And in response to Spinoza's letter, in which these distinctions are spelled out, Leibniz writes, "I set an order of degree, omnia maximum infinitum. Whatever contains everything is maximum in entity, just as a space unbounded in every direction is maximum in extension. Likewise, that which contains everything is most infinite, as I am accustomed to call it, or the absolutely infinite. The maximum is everything of its kind. This is omnia sui generis. That is, that to which nothing can be added, for instance, a line unbounded on both sides, which is also obviously infinite, for it contains every length. Finally, those things are infinite in the lowest degree whose magnitude is greater than we can expound by any assignable ratio to sensible things, even though there exists something greater than these things." Leibniz's threefold distinction between different degrees of infinity corresponds to threefold distinction between 3 kinds of things. The one all absolutely infinite degree applies to God. The quantitative infinite applies to numbers, or what may be called with much reservation, infinite quantities. This has to be qualified, for it must be understood as infinite in a syncatagrammatic, distributive, and non-collective sense, meaning that there are no infinite wholes, but only magnitudes that can be extended as one would like, or is greater than any assignable finite quantity. Leibniz calls the second degree a maximum or an infinite of its kind. And I would like to suggest that this category, the middle degree of infinity, might well fit to, might be adequate to describe Leibniz's notion of created substances. Created substances are placed between the absolutely infinite being and the infinite mathematical things, which are in fact not beings at all, but only beings of reason. In other words, created substances are placed between absolute being and non-being. In contrast to these 2 extreme cases, a created substance is infinite, but only in a particular sense, as a line may be unlimited in one direction relative to space, which is infinite in all directions. So these first 2 degrees of infinity correspond to 2 degrees of perfection. The absolute perfection is, of course, the most perfect being or God, and a partial perfection or bounded perfection characterize creatures. Creatures, while infinite in some sense, admit of different degrees of perfection and also admit of various degrees of imperfections relative to how different they are from God, which is also the absolute measure of perfection. So just as a quick reminder, let me read this bit from Theodicy 31. The imperfections, on the other hand, and defects in operation springs from the original limitation that the creature could not but receive with the first beginning of its being through the ideal reasons which restrict it. For God could not give the creature all without making it a God. Therefore, there must needs be different degrees in the perfections of things and limitations also of every kind. The question I'd like to raise here is whether, and if so, maybe say how, the notion of